Hello, my name's Richard Harvey, and I'm convening this session and moderating the Q&A portion of today's lecture. For those of you who are curious about such things, I'm a professor of computer science at the University of East Anglia. I'm a former Gresham professor, hence the connection with the City of London. Welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles, which are the lectures associated with the 695th Lord Mayor of London. In this series, we address connections in and around the square mile, what the current Lord Mayor, Michael Magnelli, calls the world's coffee house, and how those connections might help us help us tackle future global challenges. Today's lecture is Innovation in Mental Health and the GALENOS project, how to look back to move forward. Now, just a brief observation about the agenda for today, which is super simple, as you can see here. Today's speaker is Andrea Cipriani, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford, but he's also associated with many places, as you'll see from his logotastic slides. As you might expect with someone like him, his CV is rather lengthy. I noticed it included 2 doctorates. He's an MD and a PhD, amongst other things. He's also the editor-in-chief for BMJ Mental Health, which is quite a prestigious position. When he was appointed, I noticed his editorial was called "What I Stand For" as BMJ Medical Health Editor. How many of us would like to write a paper that starts with "What I Stand For"? I certainly would. Right. Well, I'll post a link to his sort of abbreviated CV so you can find a bit more about him in the chat. But as we often say in this series, life is too short for CVs or resumes if you're watching from the United States. We in this series prefer to take people as they come. So that's what I'm going to do now, and I'm going to hand over to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Richard, and of course, thank you for this prestigious invitation. Can you see my slides?
You might just have to reshare them.
Sorry. Share.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
I would say thank you very much for this invitation, especially for Michael, the Lord Mayor, because he is really supportive of this project. It's a fantastic opportunity for me, with my hat of director of GALENOS, to present the project to a wider and diverse audience, especially because it is all about connection and sharing ideas and getting feedback about what we're trying to do, mainly to improve the outcome of our patients. I'm a clinical academic. I work in Oxford. I see patients every week in my clinic. And one of the big problems we have in mental health is we lag behind other fields of medicine. So we are trying to catch up with the science in terms of brain health. And Galenos is a new way trying to foster innovation using existing data. This is why I like this definition of Galenos as a literature-based discovery science in mental health. Galenos is actually an acronym which stands for Global Alliance for Living Evidence in Anxiety, Depression, and Psychosis. It's funded by the Wellcome Trust because people at Wellcome Trust, especially Niall Boyce, had this vision of using existing data to accelerate discovery and innovation. And the inspiration of the project, if I may say, probably you clearly see that my accent is terrible. So I come from Italy. And one of the reasons why I decided to move with the family to the UK is because of the richness of the environment and the tradition that Britain has. And I'd like to start this presentation about Galenos with a quote from Chaucer, one of my favorite writers. Of course, I cannot read the old English, it's almost German, that he used, but I found inspirational this quote about finding new science in old books. And these are his own words translated in modern day English. For out of old fields, as men say, comes all this new corn from ear to ear. And out of old books in good faith comes all this new science that men hear. And that's a fantastic inspiration, because in science we have one problem, which is a huge amount of evidence produced and literature produced. On the right hand side, you can see over the last 50 years the exponential growth of publication in the scientific literature. But this is a huge amount of data with lack of focus, because in mental health, we lack the understanding of the underlying mechanisms about why things like treatments work or don't work. We also have a terribly fragmented approach. Each researcher in different countries. They're working in silos, while exactly that's the spirit of this fantastic series of meetings. Connection and trying to work together is actually the best approach. I mentioned this tenfold increase in publication. Without a real improvement, we didn't move the needle in terms of improving the outcome of our patients, in terms of available treatment, especially drug treatments. And there's a huge research waste, because all these efforts funded with public money or philanthropists or other sources actually are not coordinated. And our idea, which was Wellcome Trust idea, Niall's idea, was actually we are too late in the discovery pathway. Can we find a hidden signal in the existing data and then guide and drive innovation with the rationale, which is not serendipity, is not by chance, but it's actually with a scientific approach, as other fields of medicine do. So our vision is pull together the best science, and we call it early phase. So we want to look at experimental studies where we understand the mechanism of action of things, whether they are in terms of treatment, in terms of diagnosis, in terms of risk prediction. We want to synthesize all this evidence and also avoid the previous mistakes, because there's no point in replicating something that didn't work. Actually, we should intervene early and stop any program that is not leading anywhere. The other thing is we don't want, in order to increase, the signal to noise ratio, we want to use the entire evidence, which means not just human studies, but also in vitro studies, like animal studies, because if we want to understand the mechanism, especially in mental health, we need animal models. They have their own limitations, but at the same time, we can address important issues like dose effect or heterogeneity of effect, which is very informative also for the human development of these interventions. The other key pillar for Galenos is a real co-production. We are partnering with MQ, which is a fantastic organization in the UK, but with a global output, trying to do co-production, incorporating patient and public involvement in the research of mental health. And this is crucial because this is what, like the engine behind Galenos, informing the science we do, but also helping us in the dissemination. I'll come back to this in a second. And the last point is we really want to be global. There's no reason to be focused on the US or Europe. For us, it's important. For many other people, of course, it's important the global south, the global perspective, because mental health is a global problem. So there's no reason to limit the potential of this discovery science to only part of the world. So the benefits that we are advocating are, of course, if we understand the mechanism, then it's easier to produce a meaningful outcome. And the characteristic of Galenos is producing what we call living systematic reviews. So we collect and synthesize the evidence, but then continuously update so we can generate new knowledge, and we don't have to wait years before we update a review, because they are self-maintaining in a sort of updated mode. And our plan is in 3 years, that's the funding we have at the moment for the project, to produce 12 living systematic reviews about depression, anxiety, and psychosis across different areas, from treatment to diagnosis and risk prediction. We clearly we are advocating for open science, so all the data are open access, all the publication are open access. We share the data because we want to create this global community around open science. Because this is a huge endeavor with living systematic review that will grow over time, another arm of the project is about automation, and I'd like also to have feedback from the Q&A today, because we of course, we are looking at AI-driven approaches to do this automation, maintain the reviews up to date, extract the data, analyze, and all the things that are around this huge amount of data and using cutting-edge data science. We also are very keen on building capacity, and this is why part of the project is the international crowd, a group of researchers and clinicians across the world that are contributing to the project. They are used now, for instance, to train the model and the machine learning in order to do the automation. But this is also a way to educate the next generation about the importance of having evidence-based approach in mental health. Another output which is innovative for Galenos is the ontology. Again, I'll come back to this in a second, but it is a new way to look at how we search for information. Ontology is a knowledge structure that can really connect different pieces of information in a more comprehensive and holistic approach. And then our ultimate aim is to really drive new science and discovery. We don't want to go to look back, look at the existing data simply to dwell into this data, but we want to understand what is there that can drive new discoveries. This is a picture of the globe just to show that and demonstrate that Galenos is global. We have a leadership group leading the project mainly in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. We are expanding, of course, to the US and also to South America. But the network of collaborators is really across the world, is truly global. We have a structure, and I'm showing this slide mainly because, again, I'd like to have feedback. It is the starting point. It's quite rigid. I'd like to create a more flexible structure in order to meet the needs that we will encounter in the next few years, especially if we renew the funding and we go ahead for a few more years. But the leadership group is to take responsibility at the same time, incorporating patient and public involvement, at the same time to liaise with other key stakeholders. Of course, the funders are important for the global perspective, but also it's important to have this link with the International Advisory Board, which are content experts and other stakeholders, including industry, which is a fundamental driver for innovation in mental health. And then within Galenos, we have 4 work packages. The evidence synthesis work package is when we do the systematic reviews, but it is informed by the lived experience group work package because they are involved at all the different steps of the project. We have a dedicated work package for global collaboration and capacity developing and strengthening. And I also wanted to emphasize the importance of data technology, and we have a work package exactly for this. How can we, or how are we embedding co-production? Co-production, so working with experts by experience, people with lived experience, is going throughout the whole process thanks to the support and leadership of MQ. And evidence collection is not only the consultation on the scope and the definition of the problem that we want to tackle, but also we train PPI, so patient and public, into evidence synthesis in order to have a more informed contribution. They are involved in identifying gaps in the analysis. Of course, they're also crucial in the prioritization work, which is once we have the data, what next? what are the questions that we want to prioritize in terms of research, in terms of also the triangulation, which is combining data, human and animal. And once we have all these results, how do we translate these to a lay audience and develop lay understanding of findings and leading on dissemination at the global level, also to produce new content for future research? Ontology. I have a couple of slides dedicated to ontology because it was something new to me. And when I was planning Galenos, I came across this fantastic opportunity because it is about information, it is about knowledge, but it is also a structured way to organize and categorize information, linking idea, linking subject areas. And this is where the knowledge structure is important, because we have these entities and we have a definition and description of the relationship between these entities. At the bottom of the slide, we have the link for the Galenos project and specifically the page on ontology. And this is another slide about ontology to show how we use different ways of calling things in mental health according to diagnosis, according to other criteria or other previous ontology experiments. So we define the scope, integrate the sources, but then using expert and people with lived experience, we use these tools to search, browse, navigating, and visualize this connection of knowledge, which is at the same time broader but also more focused. And we have experts from UCL who are leader in the world, and also collaboration with Zurich and data science people and computer science people to develop this ontology specifically for mental health, which is something not available at the moment. Automation is key, and I really want to emphasize this today because we have a practical problem. It is not possible to do this manually. We need to improve our skills in terms of automation. But new technologies for automation not only maximize the efficiency, but I think they can also improve what we do. And we have to learn ideally from other fields, because being limited to medicine is not ideal. This is why I hope to have feedback and involvement from other stakeholders, because I know that the science about automation and technologies is very well developed in other fields, from engineering to computer science across the world. One thing that we have in Galenos is an important problem. What are we focusing on? What are our priorities? So in order to have a representative process, democratic process, we have a group of experts, including experts by experience, so people with lived experience and carers, taking into account diversity and inclusion. And they are consulted at the beginning in order to understand what are the things that matter to patients and clinicians, because we want to fill the gaps. I mentioned before the unmet need. This group of experts has to work also in terms of global engagement, because it's not something limited to a sector or a small area. It has to be relevant for the globe. And once we identify these unmet needs, we build these roadmaps in terms of producing research and highlighting what can be done next. For instance, this is of interest for Wellcome and other funders, where they can identify and develop targeted calls, grant funding, or that's a way to develop research in that sense. Not only improving the outcome of patients, but identifying what is the next step. We also think it's important to contribute and do this with a debate in international scientific literature. This is why we have a program of publications, not only presenting the results, but also raising awareness around the importance of what we do. This is an example of the paper we published last year presenting Galenos, but many papers are in the pipeline, because we want to not only attract attention, not only to get feedback, but also to really collect a global perspective and embed it into Galenos. Let me give you a couple of examples. So we started with 3 reviews that we completed now. One was about the prodopaminergic drugs for anhedonic depression. This is something known in the literature, or supposed to be known, that some drugs working on dopamine may be better at addressing anhedonia, which is the lack of pleasure that people have when they experience depressive symptoms. And we did the review, and it is very interesting. One of the findings that will be published soon, I just give you a sort of highlight. But probably is not really the dopaminergic action, which is the most important thing for anhedonia, which is quite heterogeneous. So we may miss the trick if we focus only on dopaminergic, and we hope that this review will identify new target for new treatments for anhedonia in depression. The second one is completely different. We want to do something about psychotherapy, something that can be easy to access worldwide, and that's exercise. So we look at exercise alone or in combination with psychotherapy to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, we are trying to identify what are the moderators of effect. Well, one of the things that is suggestive is and interesting is the amount of exercise is crucial for the effect on PTSD. So like a dose effect that is coming out from exercise. The third one is an example about new drugs for psychosis. We had 50 plus years with the same mechanism of action about psychosis. Recently, we had new drugs, including this trace amine associated receptor 1, PAR1 agonist. And it was an interesting thing because we identified potentially targeted patient population that can benefit from this medication, which are not probably more effective than existing antipsychotics, but they have a different side effect profile, and they can also be used as add-on treatment. And then the next 3, we will look at circadian dysregulation and how these can define the phenotype of depression in different population, which means also lack of response to traditional antidepressants and actually better response to innovative treatments. We have another review about cognitive bias modification in phobia, which is something about how the mind is building its own thoughts in order to address these anxiety symptoms. And we have another one in the pipeline about the risk factors for cognitive impairment in psychosis. So this is the website, and I invite you to go and look at the website and give us feedback because it is something we are building together, and we want to create this global network at all these different levels. So to finish, just a couple of quotes. One is, I think, very important from a patient representative of the NIHR Oxford Health Biomedical Research Center here in Oxford, where I work. And they said spontaneously when we discussed GALENOS that GALENOS can really mark a breakthrough progress in new tools, treatment system for the prevention and early intervention of major causes of mental illness. I think it was very important for us because it means that the message that we are trying to deliver is understood by patients and clinicians, which is the ultimate user of what we try to do, but also they are the driving force of the entire GALENOS project. And the final slide is, if you want, is a bit selfish because I come from Italy. I mentioned Chaucer, but there's a great composer, in brackets. I tried to be a musician before becoming a psychiatrist and I failed, so that's my soft spot about music. But Giuseppe Verdi was a great musician, and at the end of his life, he was asked to comment about all the new music that was coming at the end of the 19th century. We had Wagner, we had all the Viennese school and all the avant-garde and so on. And he said basically, let's turn to the past. That will be the progress. So if we look at what other people did before, we can really understand what will happen and we can make it better. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful, perfect timing. And great to end with George Green. What did he say about Verdi? Was it he has some beautiful 10 minutes, but some very long 3/4 of an hour about Wagner? Yeah. Right. Questions. I'm going to take the first, I think, because I was really fascinated by what you're doing, Andrea. And so you had this graph, and it went up to 100,000, and I thought, and you pretty broad search terms. I think there were mental health,
Yeah.
depression, and psychosis, and I thought only 100,000. It that's so I work in machine learning, and the same graph is about the same size. And machine learning is a minuscule part of, you know, it has a minuscule impact, I would say, compared to some of the things you're looking at, which leads me to the question, really, which is, um, it seems like psychiatry is still a subject where everyone could, in principle, know each other. Do you think that's true? That principal researchers are still in contact with each other, and there are informal networks that are sufficient to share, to some degree, good information.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Richard. Yes, it is a small field compared to other fields. Of course, computer science is developing, but in other more traditional fields of medicine like cardiology, of course, there's nothing comparable. If you look at the number of journals dedicated to psychiatry, is smaller than other fields. However, the big problem is what I try to give as a message is the fragmentation.
Mm.
And one problem we have in psychiatry is ideology. There's a lot of friction, a lot of ideology in favor or against something. I don't know if it is because of the tradition we had historically, or because people think that because the mind is in the brain is separated from the body is a different thing. I don't know. Maybe a limitation of us as a psychiatrist. But the problem is exactly that we fight because of ideas rather than having data. And this is what we try to do with Galenos. And we have to learn a lot from other fields of medicine, but also, as you mentioned, computer science, because this is the fresh air and the fresh eyes that I hope we can bring to mental health. Mental health is too parochial, and that's the big problem.
I see. Yeah. So this does happen in various academic disciplines, isn't it? You get factionalization, and um, lack of data tends to lead people down a particular treatment path or a particular analytical approach, and it can be very difficult to bring people together. May I
Yeah.
also ask you about your ontology? So I was very struck by in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, which sort of hinged upon a whole load of psychiatric evidence about DSM, which was
Mhm.
you know about, but I think I can explain, which is a sort of manual of psychiatric disorders. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a list.
Diagnostic statistical manual.
Thank you, brilliant. But it's a list, but it probably isn't an ontology in the sense that I understand it. So I wondered if you could just sort of draw out the difference between listing something and having an ontological description of something.
Absolutely. Yes. So you're right. The DSM is what the American Psychiatric Association produced. We are now the fifth is the edition. So it's a list of symptoms based on how frequently they are presented in patients. This is judged by experts. And they have this long list. And according to the DSM, if you want to do a diagnosis of depression, you need to have 5 symptoms out of 9, and two of them has to be either low mood, for instance, or lack of interest in things. So it's very structured. It is a starting point, but it failed the aim because it's too rigid. It doesn't represent what we see in clinical practice. And the other problem is you categorize depression as 5 out of 9, but uh, one of these 9, for instance, is either lack of appetite or increased appetite. One is lack of sleep or excessive sleep.
Mm.
So, with the same diagnosis, you have completely different phenotypes. You have patients with completely different characteristics. And that's where the problem is. We label also antidepressant to treat depression, but they are actually targeting different things if you are eating too much or sleeping too much or vice versa. And this is where the ontology can really help. So it's using this information, but connecting this information with other sources of data, other sources of information that make it more granular, more meaningful. Because otherwise, it's too superficial. It's good for insurance because you say what it is, but the patients perceive this is a label, and we don't want to mark patient with label. We want to help them identify what are the best treatments. And you miss the trick because you don't really understand the depth of what we're trying to do. Also, in terms of searches, so we use the ontology to search for the best evidence to answer this specific question.
I see. Yeah, and an ontology not only contains links between things, but it can also it can deal, I think, with the this is a subclass of this problem as well,
Exactly.
which presumably is can be tricky. Right, on to questions. I've monopolised the questions long enough. Right, I have a question here from Shane Dringan, and he says it's laudable to open source the data for people to access. How can this behaviour be encouraged more broadly across science? It seems like with the popularity of websites like Sci-Hub, research is still not readily available. Wow.
Yeah, it is a big problem because on one hand, some of the data may be limited in terms of access because of patent issue, or another thing that people often say is the anonymity, because especially for rare diseases, if you give access to everybody to a data set, they may identify the patient. So there are real issues that we need to take into account. It's not as easy as it may seem. However, I think, I mean, Richard, you are a computer scientist, so you know better than me. Now, I think we have the tools to protect privacy and be able to allow access to data. For instance, we often have access to data, but we cannot download the raw data. We do the analysis on a sort of cloud. So this is the technology is helping, but I think it's also the mentality. So researchers and scientists, we tend to protect our data because we build our career on our data set. And the paradigm shift, which comes from other fields like physics, like other areas, is to share the data in computer science, because then it's much easier to improve the knowledge in this field. And I think the only way forward in order to make it more common is to make it mandatory. And some of the funders now are asking, also journals, when you publish a trial, they ask you to make the data available.
Yeah.
Of course, we limit the access to something like a protocol, because otherwise people start analyzing the data without any rationale. But I think there's no way back. Data have to be open access to researchers and other people in order to improve what we know about the things.
Yeah, I wouldn't be optimistic of getting a grant funded without some promises on open source myself.
Mm.
What was I going to ask you? Yeah, data poisoning. I wanted to ask you. So one of the commendable things about what you're working on is that, you've got users involved in the work if they want to be. That's really impressive. But then you've got the problem that bad actors add bad data to your database, or your reviews get updated by someone who's got an axe to grind. So
Mm.
that's data poisoning. How are you going to defend against that?
Of course, we try to do our best to defend against that. It is a transparent process, so we know everything in terms of who is doing what, and we know that we are making some mistakes. So one of the reasons why we also endorse open science is in order to be open and clear that if we make mistakes, we will improve in the next cycle. I think it's important to have multiple stakeholders, so having different visions will help us identify what is the best way forward. I have to say that another thing that we learn is we have protocols, of course, but the protocols cannot be too strict, because while doing things, we realize how to adjust. And I have to say that another steep learning curve for us is the animal data. I mean, I treat humans and I'm familiar with the human literature, but actually we have learned so many things about science looking at the animal data, and similarly with the imaging data or the in vitro data. So this is another missing part of the puzzle, looking at the separate domains as if they are separate. Actually, is there's a continuum, and we need to understand how we can combine the two. If I may say one thing that I didn't cover because I was worried to be too boring, is what we call triangulation. So when we extract the data about the same topic,
Mm.
let's say R1 agonist or dopamine agent, whatever, in animals and in humans, the reason why we triangulate is primarily because we know that the human data, they have their own bias. The animal data, they have their own bias. So the idea of triangulating is to overcome the limitation of the intrinsic bias, the intrinsic systematic error of the data set, trying to combine the two sources. And this has proven very, very useful for the first reviews, because we managed to identify important limitation, and actually we now can say that the science has improved because via the triangulation we realized where the stopping blocks were.
Mm. Yeah, well, that sounds very impressive. Now, Sarah Louise Acrill, who represents a company called wireddifferently.co.uk, has written quite a long couple of questions, which I'm going to summarise as best I can. Sarah Louise, I apologise if this is a bad summarisation. She says, I feel working in neurodiversity that much of the problem is that neurodivergent people are clogging up mental health wait lists to not get the right care at the end. And I feel, I'm skipping some of her question here. I feel that we need to look at neurodiversity and trauma, and the mental health wait lists will go right down. Do you think there's any truth in this this assertion? She writes.
Sorry, it's about the waiting list.
Well, I think her view is that there's a lot of neurodiversity around, and it's no bad thing that it's around. But if you're going to assign people with neurodiversity immediately to some psychiatric disorder category, you're going to clog up a lot of very experienced doctors dealing with something that probably isn't best dealt with at that level.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The problem is again about the diagnosis, and thank you, Sarah, for this comment, because this opens another important conversation, which is a limit we have in mental health, which is the lack of biomarkers. Because in the end,
Yeah.
if you want to measure diabetes, you have the glucose in the blood, which is, I'm simplifying, but this is a tangible measure of what you want to measure. In mental health, we're struggling. We are going there. We are trying to explore as much as we can, but at the moment, we are far behind. So having biomarkers will help the diagnosis, not because also we may need probably in, if I don't know, 10, 15 years, we may overcome the idea of diagnosis, in the sense is not the final word about something, but actually if you know what is the biomarker, you can then plan the treatment strategy. And the future is towards precision mental health, so personalizing treatment rather than the one size fits all approach that is common now in clinical practice.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Sarah Louise makes a sort of follow-up point, which is she notes that, of course, plenty of neurodiverse people also suffer from depression and anxiety and lots of human illnesses like the rest of us. But the treatment might be very different, and which
Absolutely.
sounds, I mean, that sounds reasonable, doesn't it?
It is very true, Sarah, because, for instance, another big limitation, the classical studies, we tend to have very clean population in order to preserve what we call internal validity. But this is not representative of the real world. Comorbidity, as you mentioned, is a very important thing that we encounter every day. And also it has a degree, it's a spectrum, it's not white or black. And the evidence at the moment is lacking because of the rigidity of the approach. So this is why in Galenos we're trying to dig deeper and identify this subpopulation and the symptoms rather than the diagnosis in order to develop specific tools to tackle these symptoms.
Hmm. And Shane Drinian asks, how will the Galenos catalogue be curated? What metric is used to decide what the best scientific literature is?
Another good point. So we are developing this because I'm sorry to say there's no standardized way to appraise the quality of the work we are doing. So we are developing the methodology as part of Galenos, and this program of research is led by Giorgio Salanti in Bern, who is leading the field. And we also have for the animal studies Malcolm McLeod in Edinburgh. So it is crucial because to understand the real value, the certainty of evidence is of paramount importance. And we know that, for instance, at the early stage of Galenos, we try to include the best studies in terms of study design. For instance, for the TAR1 agonist or for the dopamine, we started with randomized controlled trial. And the beauty of the living systematic review is in future updates, we will expand the types of study to observational studies in order to capture, for instance, what Sarah mentioned about the comorbidity or other symptoms domain. So it is something that we are doing. And if you follow our publications, we are developing the methods for the triangulation, for the quality appraisal, and the certainty of evidence for all this kind of data and literature.
Great. Well, I fear that we are running out of time, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so sorry about that, but it was a real privilege listening to you speak, Andrea. Actually, Bernard Hornung writes in the questions, he doesn't have a question, he has a comment, but it's a useful comment, which is, he said, possibly the best talk I've ever listened to on mental health issues and how we can better explore possible methods of caring for those who suffer from poor mental health. I have no question, but I just wanted to say thank you. So that's a nice thing to read, isn't it?
Yeah, I have to thank also because exactly straight to the point, we still suffer about stigma in mental health. And this is why I really appreciate it's a fantastic opportunity for us to be invited to talk to this audience because we need to broaden our horizon and get feedback from people with different perspectives, but to improve mental health science because it means helping people with mental health issues feeling better.
Super. Okay. Well, just a brief look ahead. These are some of the lectures that are coming ahead. This is such a wonderful series. All sorts of who would have thought that those lectures could go together? And it's a real treat. So a couple of thank yous. Firstly, of course, thank you to the audience. Thank you for your interest and engagement. Secondly, I've said it already, but I'll say it again. Thank you to Andrea. For those who want to know, this lecture and all our lectures are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel in case you want to revisit or you want to persuade your friends to have a look at it. And you can see the rest of the Knowledge Miles series on that channel as well. I'll just say that if you enjoyed this lecture, then you might also enjoy the City of London's other free lecture resource, which is Gresham College, which also has a very impressive YouTube channel, as does Zien, actually, who provide much of the expertise for this series. That's all from us for this session. Look forward to seeing you the next one. Thank you very much and goodbye.